Welcome, everyone, to the launch of a new book, Rethinking China, the Middle East and Asia in a Multiplex World. My name is Jia Wang. I'm the interim director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. This event is organized by ECMC Chair in Islamic Studies and the China Institute at the University of Alberta. The University of Alberta respectively acknowledges that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. The rise of China has many profound global, but also regional implications. This timely volume edited this timely volume critically examines the changing dynamics of multi-dimensional relations between China, the Middle East, and North Africa and Asia in an emerging multiplex world. Our event today will feature presentations and discussion among our contributors of the book, to be followed by Q&A. We encourage our audience members to submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function at the very bottom of your screen. We will try to get to your questions at the latter part of this program. I'm so delighted and honored to introduce our three speakers today. First, Professor Manucher de Raj is a professor of international affairs at Texas Christian University. He's the author and editor of numerous books and articles. Since 2008, he has published extensively on China-Middle East relations. Professor de Raj is also a frequent media commentator on Middle East politics. Next, we have Professor Habibu Conger is a professor of social sciences at Zayed University, UAE, and also co-chair of Research Committee 9, that's in social transformations and sociology of development of International Sociological Association. He has published widely on globalization, migration governance, state and secularism, nationalism, and development issues, and also Asian globalization. Next, we have Professor Mujtaba Mahdavi. He is the ECMC Chair in Islamic Studies and also Professor of Political Science at the University of Alberta. He's the author and editor of numerous works on post-Islamism, contemporary social movements, and democratization of the Middle East and North Africa, post-revolutionary Iran, and modern Islamic political thought. We're also delighted to welcome a commentator for today's program, Professor Ashley Isaray. He is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of Taiwan Studies Program at the University of Alberta. Dr. Isaray researches media and politics in China and Taiwan, environmentalism, peace and security in East Asia, and leadership politics. You can find the fuller bio of our speakers on our event website. Without further ado, I would like to first invite Professor de Raj to share his opening thoughts. Professor de Raj, the virtual floor is yours.
I think, as I would mention in my brief remarks, it's a snapshot of a larger picture that is emerging globally that allows us to see, by focusing on the regions of Middle East, North Africa, or West Asia and North Africa, and parts of South Asia, what is this larger picture that I'm going to try to talk about on the ground in the region. And for that reason, I think this is a very significant contribution to give us the facts on the ground. So let me begin by quoting a prominent writer on global affairs, Prat Khanna, who wrote a book in 2019 called Future is Asian. And his argument is, if the 19th century was the century of Europe, 20th century is the century which we call it American century, 21st century is going to be the Asian century, by and large, led by China. If that premise is accurate, which I think he provides ample evidence why we are going toward the world in which Asia is going to be a very predominant power in that world, and China is going to be the most notable one among that predominance, then China's BRI and its application on the ground that this volume tries to shed light on would be a big part of this larger picture. Let me also say that what is happening is China, like any other country in the world, reacts to perception of threats and opportunities. And on the one hand, rise of China would not have been possible on the global stage without blessing of US and its West European allies in integration of China in major institutions of global governance, politically and economically, required the green light on biggest players in these institutions, which was United States and Europe. And at the same time, the cautious diplomacy, high profile economics, low profile politics that we have seen that has served its economic diplomacy and its rise on the global stage very well so far, is in part in recognition of this fact. China, if it does not want to cross the red lines of Europe and United States, especially that Europe after Asia is the biggest center of trade and investment, Middle East and North Africa or West Asia being the third in that category. Having said that, I think what is also going on is that when China began its relationship with this part of the world, it began exploring relations with countries that had frayed relation with the United States, Iran, right? But as China's economic might expanded, then there were countries in the region that were allies of the United States, Saudi Arabia, UAE, other countries, you name it, Israel, Turkey, who decided China is too significant for them not to have as a crucial economic partner, but also as US moved towards self-sufficiency in terms of its oil and gas, thanks to shale oil and gas production in the United States. Many countries which were oil and gas rich now realize that China is the major market for export of their black gold, as it is called, their oil and gas. And gradually China used that not only to lubricate its rise on the global stage. 62% of China's oil imports come from Middle East and North Africa. Therefore, increasingly, this region is playing a significant role in China's economic rise, but also, by definition, China's political stability and China's future. So in 2019, China's investment in all corridors of Belt and Road, there are 6 of them, declined with the exception of one region, Middle East and North Africa. So as a relationship that began as a transactional one, whereby energy played a very significant role at the outset, as countries like Saudi Arabia began to normalize relation with China in 1990, Iran normalized in 1971, then China began to realize that these countries have much more to offer than just oil and gas. To just give you a picture, one of the projection analysis has concluded that the Arab nations alone by 2025 are going to have, this projection was made before COVID-19, $600 billion worth of bilateral trade with China. Let me put that in context. If you look at US versus China's bilateral trade, it has fluctuated in the last decade between $400 to $650 billion. Under Trump and now Biden, it has diminished due to tariff wars and economic warfare to $450 billion. So it means in near future, China is going to have many more trade partners that is going to render the leverage that US has economically on China not as indispensable as it has been in the past. and it's going to multiply the options of China, not only economically, but also politically. I want to be disciplined and stay with my 10 minutes that I'm allowed. So I want to end up and talk about one thing that both Mujtaba and Tughril have mentioned as a theoretical framework, and the theoretical framework also is in the title, Rise of a Multiplex World. That I would argue, and this was written before Russian invasion of Ukraine, so it's foresighted on their part, kudos to you, compliment to you, but Russian invasion of Ukraine has affirmed this thesis of the book, that as Russia becomes diminished because of it's now in a sort of a quagmire in Ukraine, no clear immediate victory that Russian leaders Putin envisioned has come to fore, and there's draconian sanctions on Russia. Iran used to have the distinction of most sanctioned country in the world. Now Russia has that distinction. Iran is number 2. So as this has happened, this is going to accentuate economic decoupling that began with Trump administration in order to impose tariffs on Chinese goods, in order to ban some of the American major companies to invest in China, divest from China's market and economy. That has continued with Biden administration. This economic decoupling, as Russia is being boycotted and sanctioned heavily, and Russia is now looking around, seeing Asia as the only refuge that it can have for export of its oil and gas. Now that European markets are saying that we're going to ban your oil and gas, we're going to win ourselves off you. So this decoupling is going to accentuate, is going to open up that multiplex world that my colleagues are talking about, whereby the era of non-alignment is over, regional cross-cutting alliances are going to emerge. And at the same time, it allows regional powers much more leeway and freedom of action, more autonomy. It's not just Russia that its footprint is going to diminish in the region, but also US military footprint has diminished in the region, but it also is going to open up the region more to China. And China's policy of non-intervention militarily, respect for sovereignty, accentuating economic ties that are potentially win-win, is going to serve its political strategy to expand its influence in this part of the world. There's a whole lot more to talk about, but I'm going to stay disciplined and stay with my time limit. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Daraj. And I would like to now invite our another chapter contributor of the book, Professor Conger, to provide your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Professor Wang and Professor Madhabi for having me at this event. I would like to say that I'm not a specialist on China, and my background is not international relations. I'm a sociologist with a broad lens. I try to look at the world as a whole, and my area of specialization in that sense is global studies, and that's why I'm interested in China and what's going on in terms of China's relationships with the rest of the world. Now, in this particular chapter, I tried to look at soft power of China and how China is leveraging on its soft power insofar as Gulf countries are concerned, so far as the larger Middle East and North African countries are concerned. So this is the kind of spatial focus that my paper has. And in course of writing this paper, with very active encouragement and support from my friend Mujtaba, I actually learned a lot. First of all, it's a little discovery. The discovery is that the idea of soft power, which is attributed to Joseph Nye, quite rightly, was actually launched by a Canadian professor. Much earlier in the 70s, 1975, Professor Bell in Canada, a political scientist, he talked about soft power. But that discourse didn't take off the way Joseph Nye's discourse took off. And what's the big issue? Again, the theoretical point in terms of soft power, that all the countries around the world try to promote a better self-image. This is what we now call branding, national branding. Countries, even like Bangladesh, try to project a better image of itself. Now, when you talk about soft power, in terms of Joseph Nye, he is basically imagining and talking about soft power in relation to or in the context of liberal democracies, where you have a robust civil society, where you have a class of intellectuals who are nominally free to express their views. And you have a culture of openness. Now, these are the assumptions under which the idea of soft power was constructed or imagined. Now, if we take this idea to China, and we see how China is promoting, and before China, obviously, Japan. Japan was the country that everyone was looking at in the early 1980s, late 70s, that Japan is #1, as Ezra Vogel's famous book title suggested. And Japan also exercised and practiced and implemented some of its soft power, drawing upon its cultural resources. And, people became attracted to Japan, Japanese business principles, Japanese diet, Japanese food, Japanese movies, Kurosawa. They became very, very popular and part of the global popular culture. But when China was emerging, back in late 90s, in 96 to be specific, Singapore's leader, who also happened to be a scholar, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, argued that China is attaining economic power, military power. What China needs is some kind of soft power to institutionalize or to establish or to reinforce its position in the world. And that, I thought, was an extremely important kind of prognosis that Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew at the time made. And Singapore newspapers in those days were writing, the commentators were commenting on the importance of soft power insofar as China was concerned. So in that background, we can see that China was promoting itself in several ways. And even before long time, before China opened up, following the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, way before that, I remember as a schoolboy that there was a Chinese, table tennis team, they call it ping pong, team came to Kolkata, India. And Indian journalists were asking them that, what do you know of India? And the table tennis players, the ping pong players said, oh, we know about Tagore. And I was fascinated by that in China, despite communism, despite Maoism, that they were not completely closed to the world. They read Tagore, the famous Nobel laureate Indian poet. So that was an important part of Chinese sort of soft power, the ping pong diplomacy that came to be known later on. And even before China launched its, sort of soft power initiative, we saw this loaning of Chinese panda to Germany, for example, and to America and so on. So that was another very interesting aspect of soft power that China was exercising. But initially, these steps were somewhat, haphazard. But these steps became concrete, following 2007, the famous speech by Hu Jintao, the president at the time. He said China should promote its soft power. And later on, this theme was picked up and much more serious initiatives were taken by President Xi Jinping. From 2012 onward, we see, the sort of charm offensive on the part of China to the rest of the world. And part of that charm offensive, that soft power exercise, was the establishment of Confucius Institute. and a budget for soft power for China was allocated something like $10 billion, which was absolutely mind-boggling in its size. And it was planned that 1,000 Confucius Institutes would be established worldwide. But so far as I know, the latest figure is something like 548 Confucius Institutes have been established with the purpose of promoting Chinese soft power. But then it comes back to this point that can we seriously talk about soft power being promoted by a very pragmatic and hard state? If we go back to the political science discourse, hard state versus soft state, and Chinese state is definitely a hard state. And that hard state is a prerequisite for the kind of economic development that China has been pursuing. And we can see that hard state feature of China in COVID crisis handling today, which is rather unique. And the contradiction is that can you create soft power out of a hard state? And we have been hearing all the new concepts like smart power. We are hearing concepts like software power, that you have to have technological sophistication, which China is achieving in education, in science, scientific education and technology. China has made enormous progress. And some of the leading universities of China, they beat hands down, even universities like MIT in the publication of top science journal, publications and so on. So China has an advantage in terms of soft power, software power rather than soft power. And the contradiction is, can you stifle, free speech, sort of liberal democratic ideals within your own country and promote a softer image overseas? You see, China is caught in that kind of contradiction. And I'm quite hopeful that, China is very different. People look at China from the lenses of their own countries. They fail to appreciate that China is not just a country, it's a civilization pretending to be a country, as one scholar said. And I'm sure out of that civilizational knowledge, China would figure out how to reconcile that contradiction, how to present a softer but pragmatic image despite the reading of China internationally. And again, the reading of China internationally is not innocent, because that process is mediated by the projection of China in the Western media, how China is presented to the audience. So there are all kinds of very complex issues of diplomacy, political economy, etc., that need to be brought into this discussion of soft power promotion from China through Confucius Institute, by drawing upon its cultural resources and civilizational resources. And what we expect, and what I kind of predict, that China would be more successful if China and India and its other allies in Asia, they present a kind of united front and what I call the emergence of Asian globalization. Of course, under the leadership of China, but China should accommodate other leaders like Korea, Japan, Singapore, India, and so on. And that would be more durable, that would be more multiplex, and that would be more stable. And I hope that we see, workings on that from China, and the leadership should come from China. And I want to thank you very much for giving me 10 minutes, and my 10 minutes are up. Thank you very much. Go back to Jia.
Thank you very much, Professor Conger, for that interesting presentation on China's projection of soft power. Now I would like to invite Professor Mahdavi to provide your opening thoughts, please.
Thank you very much. I had the pleasure of co-editing this volume with Dr. Keskin, which comprise a foreword, introduction, and 13 chapters in 4 parts to rethink and critically problematize a complex, multidimensional, and genus-based relationship between China, the MENA, and Asia in a multiplex world, a phrase I borrowed from Acharya's concept, as well as in a neoliberal context. So this is a world which has already moved towards decentering of power, authority, and value system, which doesn't necessarily mean a world with greater justice or more progressive values, but certainly a multiplex world. The key question for me in this book and in my own contribution is what do China-MENA Asia relations look like in this multiplex and yet new liberal context? More specifically, I examine three pillars of Sino-MENA relations and how MENA civil society forces, social forces actually, may benefit from this relationship. First, we need to understand China, a real China, beyond two extremes of xenophobia and xenophilia, which exists in the literature and public discourse. On the one hand, China and the idea of new Confucianism are presented as an alternative to remedy our moral, economic, and political decay. This is something Daniel Bell talked about. On the other hand, China and Confucianism are presented as an inferior, dangerous, and a major threat to peace and prosperity, something like Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization talks about. I think the fact is today's China is neither of the above. The real China is something between the two poles, and pragmatism is the key word to understand today's China. Chinese reformist leader Deng Xiaoping once famously argued, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. The cat theory, I argue, explains both China's domestic economic and developmental policy, in which development should be achieved either by planned or market economy, and also in China's foreign policy, including Sino-MENA relationship. So briefly, if I want to talk about these three pillars of Sino-MENA relationship, I would say the first pillar is a broad category of energy, trade, investment, arms trade, and security and geostrategic significance. The second major pillar is China's official policy of non-intervention, respecting MENA's sovereignty and pro-status quo. And the third pillar is something we can call it the Chinese model of development. So the first pillar on the broad category of energy and investment, we know that China's strategy of peaceful rise and in response to its rapid economic growth needed more energy, so MENA became an obvious choice for oil and gas resources. Also, we know that a strong Sino-MENA relationship would serve Beijing's security concern about Muslims Uyghur in Xinjiang's region to prevent MENA state actually support for Muslim Uyghur. So basically, this was definitely a good strategic move from China. Related to this is China's comprehensive strategy partnership plans with many MENA states, which serves both trade and investment, security concern of both sides. So MENA's strategic and geopolitical location connecting Europe and Central Asia is definitely very, very important for China. While the MENA energy is the main driving force for China's pragmatist policy with all competing states in the region, MENA states also could benefit from this relationship, particularly Belt and Road Initiative, alternative financial institutions such as Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, renewable energy, clean energy, knowledge economy, and things like that. So this is the first pillar. The second pillar, protecting political stability and status quo, basically in the service of more trade and business. And that's basically speaks to the Chinese pragmatism. And here we know that why China abstained in UN Security Council 2011 in case of Libya, same more or less in the case of Syria, but at the same time, we know that it continues arms trade with Saudi Arabia while Saudis are actually committing war crimes in Yemen, or basically supporting Assad regimes. It is actually pro-stability, but at the same time ignoring Assad's war crime. So I just want to actually show the complexity and I guess the two sides of the argument here. What does this pro-status quo policy means. So all MENA states definitely, autocratic states definitely welcome Chinese non-interventionist policy and pro-status quo because it doesn't really talk about the question of human rights. The third pillar, the Chinese model of development, I discussed this in my chapter in extensively. We can talk about at least 3 interpretations of Chinese model of development. What is this? The first interpretation is the Beijing's official discourse, which suggests that Chinese model of development is basically mean socialism with Chinese characteristics. The second interpretation of Chinese model of development is something Joshua Cooper Ramo in 2004 actually talked about this, and that's called Beijing consensus. Basically in contrast to the Washington consensus, he to some extent actually welcomed this and suggests that this is about innovating economy, sustainable economy, and pro-equality economy. The third interpretation of Chinese model of development is something David Harvey actually is interpretation, and he says what is happening in China and what exactly is going on in China is neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics. And I tend to agree with David Harvey to some extent here, because I think what we have in China is Sino-capitalism with some elements of mercantilism, of course, planned economy, and elements of authoritarianism. So definitely MENA states, autocratic state, welcome development without democracy, neoliberalism with authoritarianism, and this is something they really would welcome to this model. So the question is, to what extent the Chinese vision of the global order differs radically from the existing neoliberal order, and to what extent MENA can benefit from this Chinese path of development? I provide a few quick remarks here. The first one is that Beijing's neoliberal path, like other forms of neoliberalism, is a structural violence to environment and also to the dignity of the subalterns, both local and the global. And of course, we know that in addition to that, Chinese growing military budget, now the second largest in the world, doesn't really match Beijing's official discourse of peaceful development and peaceful rise. The second observation is that Beijing's treatment of Muslim Uyghurs, which violates their cultural and political rights, doesn't really offer a good model for the MENA society, which with multiple cultures and religious minorities, and they really need more pluralism and respect for difference. So Chinese top-down modernization, forced assimilation, and development without democracy doesn't really offer much to the MENA countries, which they really need democracy, pluralism, and social justice at the same time. The third observation is that Beijing's not quite welcoming policy towards 2019-2020 pro-democracy demonstration in Hong Kong. And it's also its cozy and complex relationship based on pragmatism with the Myanmar military dictatorship coup in 2021, again, doesn't really offer a lesson to build a more inclusive democratic society in MENA. And finally, Beijing's neoliberal policy produce, of course, and intensifies social inequality and empowers capital, not really citizen. MENA societies definitely need a pro-social justice model of development to empower citizens and to consolidate inclusive democracy. So in the absence of social justice, we know that in the global south, in the global north, always populist demagogues actually mobilize the poor and lower classes at the cost of real democracy. So MENA society definitely need a model which respects social justice and democracy at the same time. Here, finally, I offer 3 very quick concluding remarks in response to how MENA social forces, civil society, and you can see my approach is very much civil society approach, not really a state-centered approach, can benefit from Sino-Mina relations. Number one, I suggest that China is neither a savior of MENA from new liberal authoritarian trends, nor it is an evil force. China pursues Deng Xiaoping's pragmatist cat theory and in its relation with MENA. So MENA should also actually do the same while learning from China. It definitely needs to pursue its own independent politics and policy towards development and democracy. MENA can certainly benefit from BRI, knowledge economy, clean energy, investment of China, but at the same time should never allow for a new form of dependency or new colonialism with Beijing or any other country. Number two, China is neither a decisive counter-hegemonic force, nor yet a world hegemon. But at the same time, China's participation and involvement in the MENA, along with other members of BRICS in a multiplex world, could definitely consolidate a multiplex world and challenge US hegemony and unilateralism, neoliberal interventionism, things we actually saw in the case of Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. None of them are really, really good for democracy and peace in this region. So although China's support of status quo may benefit autocratic regimes in MENA, but it protects the MENA from regime change, war, intervention, which we know that they are really, really counterproductive to homegrown democracy. MENA society need peace and development so they can themselves from within challenge autocratic regimes from within, not with war or intervention. The third and last point is that the Chinese model of development, real or perceived, because China never actually claimed that its model is universal, have mixed results for the future of MENA civil society. On the one hand, it has been actually used or misused, you could say, by MENA autocratic regime to consolidate their neoliberal autocracy. But at the same time, on the other hand, it may actually in part benefit civil society and social forces in the MENA for more peace and development. MENA societies should develop their own models of development, which guarantees social justice and freedom at the same time. Each society and each region is particular, and it needs to its own path of development while learning from others. This is something I call it local approach, which is a combination of local and global. We definitely need from benefiting from and learning from global experience, China included, but based on local tradition, local characteristics and culture. So in this sense, local approach is something MENA society needs. Finally, I would say from a civil society perspective, neither the Washington consensus nor Beijing consensus is the solution for MENA society because they are actually two different sides of neoliberal discourse and economy. But at the same time, I would definitely welcome more, in participation of China because it definitely contribute to multiplex world. I should have stopped here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Mahdavi, for that very comprehensive overview of China and MENA relationship, and also for your assessment on what's the best approach going forward for MENA countries. So as our audience members already heard from three of our chapter contributors and also editor of this volume, we do have a way to provide you with a link to purchase the book if you're interested with a discount. So our team will pop it in the chat. So you will see the link to purchase this volume with a discount code, especially reserved for our audience members today. So there's a lot of rich content and diverse range of topics covering the Chinese relationship with the Middle East, North Africa, and the region. So in this multiplex world, so there's a lot of rich content, and I'm sure you will really enjoy reading this book. So now I would like to turn to our commentator today, Professor actually Isaray to provide your take on what you heard from our contributors today. Ashley.
Thanks so much, Jia. It's a great pleasure to be with this group today to talk about this very interesting project. 15 years ago, I was in Iran. I was a tourist in the city of Shiraz, staying in a nice hotel. And there were a couple of Chinese engineers working on a project there. And I heard them speaking amongst themselves at breakfast, and I went over to talk to them. And they were surprised that I could speak Chinese and kind of delighted at the opportunity to speak to someone who did speak Chinese besides each other. They'd been sent to Iran on a job by their company. And after talking for a couple of minutes, I realized they were desperate. They weren't able to convert the renminbi currency in Iran, and they were out of money to buy cigarettes. And if you're a smoker, you know that that's a serious problem. I had just come from China. By coincidence, I had renminbi on me. So anyway, we were able to work a swap for local currency, and they were on their way. And for me, that was indicative of a real early stage of engagement between China and Iran in particular. These Chinese entrepreneurs didn't really know what to expect. I guess they're engineers, they were working for a company. They didn't know what to expect when they arrived in Iran. They weren't well briefed. They didn't understand Iranian society very well, and probably felt like they weren't very well understood at the same time either. Fast forward 10 years, 5 years ago, I was living in Rabat, Morocco, and the apartment in which I lived looked over a hotel where busloads of Chinese tourists would arrive and come out, and they would go to local sites near where I lived. They were enthusiastic at exploring tourism possibilities in Morocco. They would go to my local grocery store and take pictures, it seemed to me, of literally everything. And I had wonderful conversations with them about their experiences in Morocco. I mentioned these two examples because they show how China's engagement with MENA has changed, but also how China has changed in this time period, going from roughly 2007 to 2018 or 2017, 2018 or so. China had really changed. It had gone from being a country that was biding its time and hiding its light, to quote the Deng Xiaoping expression, Ta Wang Yang Hui, to being much more assertive. Tourists were leaving the country, were finding their way to every corner of the region in which I lived. I didn't see them in the Rif Mountains, but I did see them in lots of places in Morocco. And I knew that something really big was happening in terms of China's deepening engagement with this part of the world. But as I looked around the scholarly literature, I saw very little, for example, going back to my visit to Iran, that would help me understand how China was perceiving Iran, or vice versa, besides this really good book by Garver on China-Iranian relations. There are very few scholarly articles, and there were almost no edited volumes that really unpacked this evolving relationship. Fast forward again to 2022, and we have this great new resource to help us rethink the changing relationship between the Middle East and North Africa, impacted as it is by globalization, deepening great power tension, and what I am concerned about, a growing arms race in East Asia. The book I'm speaking of course, is the one we're all here to think about, Rethinking China, the Middle East, and Asia in a Multiplex World. And it has chapters that I would have loved to have read before the trips that I've just described, chapters on Sino-Iranian relations, BRI projects in the region broadly considered, Sino-Pakistani relations, Sino-UAE relations, focusing on soft power, Sino-Egyptian relations, Sino-Turkish relations, and other important subjects. Most of the contributors to this volume, as you may have ascertained, are not China scholars in the traditional sense. They're not, in other words, people who speak and read Chinese as a matter of course every day, or who've lived in China for a number of years. The contributors are mostly experts of the Middle East, and this knowledge is well leveraged in this volume. They help us think about why improving relations with China is attractive for MENA states and why it's attractive for China. And this is important and in a sense puzzling because these MENA states have very large Muslim populations. They are jockeying at times for leadership in the Muslim world, and China is a place where there are well-documented human rights concerns facing Chinese Muslims, principally Uyghurs and Kazakhs. There are, as Mustafa nicely points out in his contributions to the volume, pragmatic reasons for this great coming together of MENA states and China. And as you may have inferred from the comments that you've heard, the reasons for this coming together are principally economic, or at least this is how they're explained typically in Beijing's foreign policy rhetoric. And they're also geostrategic for both MENA states and for China. They're geostrategic reasons for this coming together. And I think the volume rightly problematizes the notion of the expansion of Chinese soft power. This is a tricky move, in part because the ideological nature of China's domestic politics, it's a socialist-led, almost atheist country, informed as it is by Marxist regimes, Marxist thinking that is engaging in this great coming together with these Muslim majority states. It's a fascinating phenomenon that is well explained by economic interests and geostrategic interests. And as the US has partially pivoted away from the Middle East toward Asia, I say partially because the US has also become very inward looking and obviously dysfunctional in some important ways. And the US is also looking more toward Europe than has been the case, particularly in the aftermath of the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. So in this larger context, there's something of a vacuum or an opportunity for the blossoming of new relations between MENA states and China. And interestingly, ideology is not really at play here. China is not attempting to impose its ideology very much on these relationships, nor are MENA states, pushing back from a place of ideology or expressing concerns about, for example, China's treatment of its Muslim populations. All of this seems pragmatic. Now, this is a moment when I want to turn our gaze away from MENA toward East Asia. If you shift your gaze momentarily from China-MENA relations to East Asia, you see more nationalism expressed coming from China, and arguably less pragmatism. Does China really need to militarily unify with Taiwan? Does it need to, suppress Hong Kong in such a way as to lead to the end of one country, two systems, as some scholars of Hong Kong are arguing? I think you can make the case that many of these moves are driven by nationalism. China's relationship with Japan has ups and downs, but it's also very intensely disturbed by ongoing territorial disputes over the Senkakus, known as the Diaoyu Islands in China. So their nationalism is at play elsewhere, and it concerns very important political relationships for China. Of course, it's also in play with the United States being a country that has key relationships with East Asian states and also MENA states and many states around the world. The US is very much in China's way as Beijing hopes to continue to rise, apace with globalization and the expansion of markets, something that China has been supportive of. So I want to end my remarks with a question, and that is, in East Asia, we see less pragmatic behavior, much more nationalistic behavior. behavior. And I'll argue that we see this largely because domestic politics in China are much more affected by relationships in East Asia. Domestic politics arguably drive Chinese foreign policy behavior in East Asia. Right now, we don't see that happening in MENA and in China's relationships with MENA. May there come a moment when we do, when the Chinese public sees itself and its interest as much more affected by BRI projects, their success or failure, and these new relationships. That remains to be seen. But at present, China's MENA relations do seem to be an island, I think, of pragmatism during a time in which Xi Jinping's politics are looking much less Dengist, much more assertive, and much more nationalistic. What I think we have here is a very important book that has filled a great gap in existing scholarship and has commenced some interesting conversations that are going to continue for a very long time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ashley, for your comments on this important book. So, Ashley, you raised a question. I wondered if our speakers today would like to take a stab at this question. Yes, Professor Daraj, please go ahead.
Yes, I mean, that's a very astute observation, but I think it's a moving target in terms of how China is evaluating its relation with the MENA region, and it's evolving as China's economic interest in the region expands and as opportunities for China emerges further in the region. Let me also say this, that in my conversation with some of my Chinese colleagues who know about the operations of the foreign policy of China better than I do, they informed me that two countries in the MENA region are in the category of East Asia desk, Pakistan and Iran. In terms of priority of the Chinese foreign policy, they assume a special place in Chinese strategic thinking. Obviously, Pakistan, for reason of China's increasing tension with India, that can be counterposed to that. And I would say in case of Iran, there are several attributes that Iran has: the largest coast in Persian Gulf, gateway to Central Asia, Caspian Sea resources, large consumer base of 85 million. Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, they don't offer that. Neither does even Saudi Arabia. And also, if you're looking for long-term energy security, Iran's oil and gas resources, number 4 in oil resources, number 2 in gas resources, because of sanctions and war with Iraq, are not tapped into, they're not modernized enough to produce to their capacity, full capacity. So China sees Iran as also a long-term source of energy security. And last but not least, Iran is a willing partner, because it has tense relation with the United States, that when China wants to poke in the eye of the United States for what US does to China in case of Taiwan and in case of Hong Kong, right? That it can use Iran in the same category, violate US sanctions as it does now to import Iranian oil, to give it a lifeline, etc. So those are some of the reasons why this is changing. This dynamic that you described is changing. And I see that changing even further as we move forward for the reasons that I don't want to take too much time. As Belt and Road unfurls, Mojtaba briefly talked about it, region of MENA is a bridge to Europe. Also, in some ways, maritime Silk Road begins from southern Italy and comes and engulfs the rest of the world, both land line, but also the maritime line. And last but not least, China is, as you would know, is getting access to ports gangbusters in the Middle East, but also in Europe, especially Southern Europe. And also China is modernizing US closest ally in the region, Israel's Haifa port, to the dismay of the United States. These are not only in anticipation expansion of maritime Silk Road economic ties and all that, but also in future, should relation with the United States deteriorate, this could be not case of Israel, but definitely case of Iran. All of its ports can be beachhead for Chinese Navy. And so this is evolving, changing, and I think we cannot really speak of China without talking about the United States. The path that the United States has been on in the last 30, 40 years, in my estimation, is not sustainable. Numerous wars with the region, and then economic warfare. Sanctions are a dual sword. When you impose sanction on a country, you deprive yourself of access to that market. But at the same time, let's look at China-US tariff wars. What you do, you impose tariff, you make Chinese goods more expensive. Your domestic producers have to compete with that. They raise their prices. Who loses? Consumers. In this case, US consumers. This is not sustainable. And, you know, ASEAN countries, 10 members, are using local currencies, blah, blah. Even Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela, many other countries have been talking about using non-dollar currencies to do trade in energy. Saudi Arabia is warming up to that idea, biggest swing producer in the world, right? And they're putting some of their assets, sovereign wealth, not only in euro, but also in RMB, in anticipation that as this economic warfare intensifies, nations will have an incentive to use non-dollar currencies to do trade and all that. And ultimately, the global economic system, which is based on supremacy of dollar, is going to come under pressure. And this is going to come home to roost. It's not sustainable. And it goes back to what Mojtaba was talking about earlier, as a civil society-centric view would say, rather than a statist view, would say this is not also beneficial to civil society, to ordinary citizens. And that dictates the options of China, the postures of China. China still cares very much where US stands on issues, politically, economically. What are the red lines of the United States? And it does not want to pick a fight in terms of military confrontation or even economic warfare with the United States. Their official slogan is, there's enough for both of us. This is the era of co-prosperity and coexistence. I end it there.
Well, thank you, Professor Duraj, for that excellent response. As I think Professor Conger will have to run before too long, maybe I'll just turn to you for a quick question here. You were talking about soft power. China is projecting, of course, globally. And in terms of this changing dynamic of the global order, this multiplex world emerging globally, but of course in the MENA region, do you see China is adjusting its soft power projection approach, especially given its the Ukraine war, and China is facing increasing criticism from the Western nations and some other countries around the world? Do you see China, making adjustment to that approach, and also maybe toning down on the, say, wolf warrior diplomacy type of approach?
No, as far as I can see, China is not taking a firm stand. As far as I can follow, China is sitting on the fence, and I think that's the most diplomatic and that's the most pragmatic position that China can take, because and that pragmatism has been reflected in the voting behavior of China. And if we look at the larger world, because we have been extremely Europe-centered and North America-centered, but if you look at the larger world, many of the leaders have used restraint in their comments on Russian invasion. They didn't even use Russian invasion. Many of the leaders around the world, the world I'm thinking of is outside of Europe, outside of North America. So we really have a kind of confrontation here, which is not open, but it's very subtle, So the Chinese position of sitting on the fence has certain merits in that, because China is not alone in not jumping into, commenting and judging, this conflict. So in that regard, I think the leadership of China would find out how to navigate, these troubled waters and shift its position and continue with its, program of Belt and Road Initiative. But the larger issue right now is the slowing down of Chinese economy. That how can you bankroll, these huge projects internationally when you are dealing with a serious problem of unemployment in China itself and the slow economic growth. So I mean, these are very challenging times, so we have to wait and see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. Perhaps just a quick question for all the panelists here. Well, as Ashley and others also spoke about, as we can see, the U.S. is increasingly, of course, preoccupied with the situation, the war in Europe, but also this strategy, the grand Indo-Pacific strategy that leads the U.S. also more focused on containing China in the Indo-Pacific. So there is that perhaps a bit of a neglect of the Middle East. And are the MENA countries, as Professor Mahdavi advocated, need to really look at seeking independent, pragmatic, but independent approaches when it comes to engagement with China? Do we see signs MENA countries and MENA states are increasingly doing so, or are there chattering in the region that this is the approach they're hoping to seek? Professor Mahdavi, would you like to respond?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we are actually seeing, I guess, how most actually MENA states trying to realign with different powers, especially over the past few years, maintain, I guess, relationship with Russia, China, United States, Europe, because we know that especially after Trump came to power, and of course, declining interest of United States in the Middle East and more focus towards the, I guess, East Asia. So we are obviously seeing, especially in post Russian invasion of Ukraine, we see even states such as Saudi Arabia or even Iran, or even actually some other pro-US allies in this region trying actually to have more sort of, I guess, in a relationship with China, or with definitely Russia and other powers. So we are already in a multiplex world. So that's from the state perspective. But my contribution was, as I mentioned, not quite actually state-centric, but more inclined towards civil society. And we know that in the case of MENA, there are autocratic states, and they do not necessarily represent the interest of civil society. And here, definitely, I would say, a more multiplex for definitely serves the interest of civil society in MENA. More balanced relationship with other powers, including China, serve the interest of civil society. But at the same time, there is absolutely no guarantee, because at the end of the day, MENA's civil society needs their own independent path of development, which should guarantee not only social justice, but also freedom, equality, inclusiveness, pluralism, and democratic values. And that's definitely something this society needed.
Thank you. And there's a question, of course, from the audience members wondering about the Chinese model of development. You spoke about it could potentially undermine civil society in MENA region. And so are there certain long-term political implications, long-term political stability implications for the region? because of this Chinese model.
Yeah. As I briefly mentioned, I mean, Chinese never actually claimed that their model is universal. They always said this is our own way of actually development. But at the same time, we know that some autocratic states, they definitely welcome any model which ignores democracy. So development, economic development without democracy, or any form of neoliberal authoritarianism. So that's what some, I guess, states in the MENA would welcome this. So that's their perception. That's what they really see it. So I would say that when it comes to the issue of maintaining stability, peace, and any help for any form of economic development, China's involvement could be actually positive because it could diversify different sources. And this is, of course, in addition to my radical critique of neoliberal economy, because I don't think neoliberalism is the solution, the American or the Chinese model of it. But at the same time, I would say that if this model undermines citizenship, democracy, pluralism, intensified top-down autocratic modernization for the MENA region, it's not going to help MENA civil society. And that's why I would say MENA civil society needs their own independent path for development and democracy. Yeah.
And Professor Daraj?
If I may add a few thoughts to that, there's a great deal of appeal in China's economic miracle, a country that used to be colonized or semi-colonial, a country that struggled hard to alleviate poverty, and Chinese have brought some 800 million people out of poverty in the last 40 years. A country that had major problem with opium addiction, with backwardness and lack of development, suddenly has had this miraculous surge economically in the last 40 years and used to call itself the largest developing nation in the world. How can they not be a source of tremendous allure, attraction, curiosity for the rest of global South? They are. Having said this, but I think more sober minds are realizing what happened in China is very unique. China has used its massive population as an asset, disciplined, cheap labor. China's culture has contributed a great deal to the work ethic that it's very difficult to find in many other parts of global South. China's also rise on the global stage was abandoning Mao's ideological politics of the past, right? And they do business with everyone, no matter what the regime is. Regime change is not on the agenda, and they don't have much of an ideology to export at this point. I endorse Chinese official definition of themselves is socialism with Chinese characteristics, but the reality is that Communist Party increasingly manages a capitalist economic system domestically and globally, right? So a state capitalism or neoliberal capitalism as a counterpoint to Chinese professed idea is that. So most of the countries in the world are trying to replicate Chinese economic miracle, not necessarily, and Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristic by definition is appealing to Chinese only. It's not a universal ideology like democracy that is appealing universally. China lacks that element. We're going back to the discussion of soft power, that element to export its political system as a model for the world. Okay, so there are limitations there that are, I think Chinese really realize that. That's why they accentuate economic ties, and they are, as I have said in my foreword, traders par excellence. If you take 27 years of Maoism in a large historical context of more than almost 5,000 years of Chinese history, that was an aberration. These were people who Silk Road 2,100 years ago began there. They were traders par excellence, and they were doing trade with Middle East and interacting with Middle East and North Africa long before Europeans got on the scene, okay? So the 27 years is a blip in that historical context. They have returned to main contour of their history, that is becoming traders par excellence. And I think that's the key to Chinese allure. And for some authoritarian states, of course, they also see, well, Communist Party is no democracy, and they have done all of this under guidance of Communist Party. Maybe that's the model for us to go with.
Well, thank you. Perhaps we're near the end of the program. Oh, sorry. Go
And
ahead.
if I may, actually, just one quick point with respect to whether or not Chinese model of development can be applied to the MENA region. I think perhaps for two other additional reasons, maybe it's not quite actually fit the region. The first reason is that many of these MENA states actually are rentier state, and the rentier economy does not necessarily mean actually can follow the same Chinese model of development. The second point is that in many of these countries, top-down modernization or economic development without democracy has failed. The classic case is Iran before the revolution. I mean, 1979 revolution was a response to this model of development. Or more recently, you have Green movement in Iran and the Arab Spring, which were actually demands for democracy. So democracy, freedom, citizenship are very much alive demands, and the quests are very much alive. I think it's not an unfinished, it's an unfinished project. So definitely this region needs democracy, but at the same time, social justice. Social justice, inclusive, I guess, democracy and more, I guess, democratic demands. That's my final point. Yeah.
All right. Ashley, I see your hands up too. Go ahead.
Muted.
Just a point or two chiming into this really interesting conversation about the China model. I agree with much of what's been said. The China model isn't all that exportable. Maybe there's a term that can help us think about where China is and how it got there. And that's one that was preferred by an advisor of mine in graduate school, Alfred Stepan. It's the term that China's post-totalitarian. It's not really authoritarian. In the post-Mao period, we have crushed civil society that is just re-emerging only to then be flattened again by Xi Jinping's government. We have a lot of education that was very conducive to high capacity performance and the economic growth, but also we had the great East Asian model for economic development. China was learning from Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and South Korea, and other states. So there are a lot of reasons why China developed, but it's a very different social fabric than you would find in any of the MENA states, where there's still a lot of religious autonomy. Even I think in Iran, there's more religious autonomy than you would see in many religious institutions in China. So social fabrics are really quite different. State-society relations in some way, I think is quite different. So, I don't think the China model is all that exportable, but that doesn't mean that China can't help, for example, to make MENA states more high capacity, for example, by sharing information, related to technology and economics, or through technology transfer coming from projects, or from exporting authoritarian techniques for managing public opinion, an expression long used in the propaganda sphere in China, controlling the internet, dealing with social media. These are things that China can really help with. State surveillance, China's really got that down, I think, more than any state in the world today. So there are ways that authoritarianism in MENA states can benefit from the sorts of technology that China has to share, even if the model itself is not being sort of transferred in any way, just because of the great difficulties in doing so. And China is a really ideological country. Xi Jinping is neo-Maoist in many ways. He's bringing back ideology that leads him to put firms under the thumb and increasing control of the Chinese Communist Party. It's the ground, at least in China's domestic politics, is really shifting. So hopefully Middle Eastern societies are seeing that and developing the expertise that will help them benefit from these new opportunities that are emerging, as geopolitical shifts take place in the world. I think building up capacity to see China clearly, to work with China clearly, is going to be essential, not just in the Middle East, but all over the world.
Thank you, Ashley. Perhaps just one really quick question to conclude our event today. And I'm just hoping that our speakers can perhaps consider a rapid fire type of answer. It's a question that comes from an audience member. It's about Canada, but I think we can broaden it to other countries as well. It's just, how can a country like Canada or the US help nurture this kind of a peaceful emergence of this multiplex system, and perhaps building connections with MENA countries? Is it possible that countries like middle power Canada or superpower like the US help nurture this, and grow a peaceful, multicultural, a multiplex world? Is it possible?
If I may take a stab at it, and I'll try to be brief. A lot would happen what is happening in the United States politically. Unfortunately, since 2016, we have learned that political pendulum can swing wildly to the right in the United States in very unpredictable ways. And therefore, you cannot, and as I think Mushtaba was talking about it, or someone else, that the political cycles are short political cycles in the United States. You don't plan for the long run as China does, right? You plan, for example, Biden is struggling. Should I sign JPPOA with Iran? If I do, am I going to come across weak? Am I going to lose the November election in Congress or not? That's the whole American strategy evolves on. Major non-proliferation treaty and all that. So as long as that exists and persists in the United States, you really cannot count on rational calculus of what is good for the world, what is good even for national interest of the United States in the long run that would guide the policy. And US is the big elephant in the room. So that's one. And the second one, middle powers like Canada, as long as they have certain autonomy from their neighbor to the south, yes, they can. There's a great book on middle powers and the role that they can play in global politics, that as this multiplex world emerges, there is room for them to maneuver and assert themselves and realize that the world of superpowers is gone, and we need to respect that autonomy of regional powers more and more if we want to have a peaceful world.
Yeah, I can add to this briefly. I think despite the rhetoric of human rights and democracy and democratization, I would say almost all states' foreign policy is guided by pragmatism. I mean, democracy or non-democracies. I mean, China is honest to say that I don't really care about human rights, but there are democracies who actually have rhetoric of human rights, but there is also hypocrisy, and they are not quite actually consistent with supporting democracy, human rights in other countries. And that's why we see mostly they actually prefer supporting their own, even friendly tyrants during the Cold War or even in post-Cold War, post 9/11. They are not consistent supporting democratic values or human rights if the country is their own allies. So in this sense, I think pragmatism is very much guiding principles of foreign policy of a state, especially if they are superpower, great power, or even to some extent middle power. With respect to how states, middle powers can help promote multiplex world or democracy or human rights, I would say definitely no war, no intervention, and no massive punishment of population in form of so-called economic sanction, which actually kills middle class, which is the engine of democratization. And that is exactly happened for Iraq, for Iran, or for other countries. So when you actually kill the middle class engine of democratization by sanction, because a state always actually find a way to divert the pressure from the state to civil society. So these so-called smart sanction, which is nothing really, it's everything but the smart, because it kills civil society. These are not really helpful. So I would say the engine of change comes from within, and anything can support civil society and social forces in the context of peace, stability, development is really, really helpful. And definitely less war, intervention, military intervention, and economic sanction. Yeah.
Well, I'll just add a thought or two here. I think in an age in which it's really hard for countries and their representatives to speak to each other in ways that lead to constructive change, the place to start for middle powers and everyone else is respect for cultures and common interests. This is the fundamental foundation of civility, for state-to-state relations as well as, intra-societal relations. It's absolutely crucial that we have in our rhetoric, internationally and domestically, respect. That's the place we lead from, and then civility. And going from there, I think you look at common interests. You start, diplomatic negotiations of whatever type by emphasizing the common interests and trying to build on common interests and advance them, while flagging, of course, important divergences of common interests. And I'm less certain than Mustafa that you can always avoid war. I think, to paraphrase Trotsky, war sometimes chooses you. You can't always choose to stay out of war, but you can certainly hope to avoid it by all means possible. And I share your hope that it can be avoided, looking principally at East Asia, but also at the possibility of a broadening of conflict in Europe. China is increasingly assertive and increasingly self-confident under Xi Jinping's leadership. He's less likely, I think, to listen to advice, prodding, pressure from Washington or any other state than has been the case since really the Mao period. So that change is something that people have to recognize. China is hard to change, but I think soft power is a very useful way that middle powers in particular can leverage what they know and what they have to offer in all related conversations with China.
If I say just a quick point, I think in the case of Middle East, all these recent wars were illegal, unethical, and they were actually based on fabrication of information. And it's not actually war by choice or something simply happened. United States, Europe actually were involved in this illegal, unethical war, which destroyed Middle East civil societies, from Iraq to Afghanistan to Libya to even Syria, to indirectly, or in terms of economic sanctions. Look at what they've done actually to this region. I'm not blaming everything to the foreign powers. Definitely there are autocratic regimes definitely responsible for disaster. But when it comes to the global factor, all these wars actually were fabricated based on a bunch of lies, misinformation, and no one is actually in charge of these war crimes at this point. And you can actually see these double standards based on what's happening in Ukraine, which was definitely wrong. I mean, Russia should have been condemned because of this illegal war, but you see this double standard with respect to the war in the Middle East. There is no justice in this context, and I think Middle East, MENA region, Asia, global South, actually South definitely needs peace and stability to come up with their own model of inclusive development. And let's hope for that. Let's hope for that, for this sort of stability and peace in the multiplex war. Thank you.
Thank you. On that hopeful note, we will conclude our event today. This was a truly fascinating discussion. Thank you, all the speakers and the commentators as well, for sharing your expertise and rich perspectives at our today's event. And for our readers, please remember to click on the link in the chat to look at the book, and you can enjoy that discount code to make a purchase. And I would like to thank all the colleagues for putting together this event. And finally, a big thanks to all the audience members for attending our book launch today. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.